Controversial subjects with the facts can be tense, but we are a sub-science here to make things make sense.
Today we are talking about science and racism. We made a video called The Science of Racism, sort of calling out the fact that science is sometimes perceived to be something of a moral high ground, and we think it's important that we talk about the biases that exist within it in light of everything that is going on right now.
How's it going?
Was that okay? I feel like I said some words wrong. I'm just like exhausted.
Oh yeah, it sounded fine to me. But
Okay.
I'm also...
We listen to it back. It's gibberish. So we're recording this on, we should even say what day, because
it's Monday.
But
I don't know.
Monday,
what day,
June. Oh, it's June 1st.
That's also depressing.
Wow, the world. The year is half over. The world half over. No.
Okay. Obviously, a lot is going on right now. This podcast might be a little different because we're going to kind of skip the What'd You Learn This Week and just kind of jump into what we're talking about today. But
yeah, and I think to give a bit of context, it's like we have tried to talk about the issues of white supremacy within science throughout our careers as science communicators. We've made this video called The Science of Racism about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, pretty much actually. Just highlighting the fact that science does reiterate the fact that racism is real, that it is damaging. And it's obviously a hard thing to talk about, especially as non-Black people, but the science does exist. There's not nearly enough of it. And part of the reason why there isn't enough of it is that science is STEM is an extremely white space. And I think one thing we can really speak to is that as science communicators, the science communication space is embarrassingly white. When we go to science communication events, it's shocking. It's actually extremely shocking. And so I think that is just an example of part of the issue with science and with this idea that science isn't biased and this idea that science is finding the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I hear that a lot, and we'll maybe get into some of our personal experiences of even coming out and then being like, why are you coming out? It's science. It doesn't matter. And to me, the only real thing I think I can even say and what's going on as a white man is just that I'm a science communicator, and I'm just so aware of this weird narrative that if you or are interested in science, for some reason you don't have to talk about race because it's doesn't exist or it's not an issue in this space. And that to me is just always been really frustrating.
Uh-huh. So
Does
I
that
think
make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think today we want to throw out there the research that we've done and bring this to people from a perspective of to white people and talking to white people specifically about what we can learn from this, how we can be educated so that we kind of know what it's like. And I'm sure many people listening, if you're minorities in one way or the other, it can be exhausting and frustrating to be a minority and have to constantly educate people. So this is hey, let's talk about this. This is a call in, as you've put it before, to people who are ready to learn and listen and make a change and make a difference and actually accept things. Something I saw the other day on Twitter that stood out to me was someone saying, retweet this with when you had your first Black teacher. And I actually think, unless you can correct me, in university, I don't think I had a single one.
Yep. I didn't have a single one either.
And
Except I went to teachers college, and then in which most of my teachers were Black, but I was being taught anti-racism.
Right.
So,
but I mean, we went, because I was thinking my high school did not have a very diverse population. I come from a smaller town, whereas I feel you're from Toronto, so you probably had a little bit of a different experience with race growing up. But I was okay, I didn't really have very much diversity there. I don't think I had a teacher in high school either that was Black. But universities where I'm no, but it's a university. It attracts people from all over the world. Not to say that there are no people of color, and there certainly were professors who were non-white, but I actually don't know if I had a Black professor ever.
So does that mean that technically you didn't ever have a Black teacher ever in your life?
I'm notorious for having a bad memory, and I haven't sat down and really thought through all my grades. But as far as I can whip through, no.
Wow.
And that's why I was like, well, we went to university together, so you would know if I was wrong about the university side
I
of it.
had one black teacher my whole entire life. So let's get into our first statistics. 83% of teachers in America are white.
83% of
yes
of what? Sorry,
teachers in America are white.
Oh my god! Wow.
So that's there you go. Okay, so let's just start there. So that is staggering. 62% of Americans are non-Hispanic white. So there is if you want to, make whatever point, which is that teachers should represent who the students are, there's a huge issue there. And that leads into something, which is also another study that we talked about, which is that teachers as early as preschool are more likely to punish a black student more severely for the same misbehavior than a white student. They studied this. This study is actually really well done. It's like a meta-analysis of lots of different people and situations. Also, leading into adulthood, studies find that the prison sentences for black men are 10% longer than white men arrested for the same crimes, and use of force is 3.6 times higher. So there you go. If you're a white person listening to this is an example of obvious racism that is real within America. And I think it is important to bring up what we were just talking about, which is that 83% of teachers in America are white. And that is an issue because now I'm going to try and speak from my own experience as someone who was trained to be a teacher. I can't think of a more impressionable atmosphere when you're standing in front of kids and then you are literally teaching them how the world works. It is so important, and
not just once, nearly every day of their lives.
And the biases that come out are so you're just explaining things to them and how they work from your world to their world. So as a white person, you are going to be explaining things and mostly what I would say leaving tons of information out because of your experience. And that bleeds into the racism. That's what institutional racism is, because you can't, as a white person, not be and say racist things because it's institutional. It's ingrained within all of us. And so that is a great example.
And just be lacking full perspectives, right? Even when things aren't intentionally hurtful, if you're talking to someone, even us here right now, two white people, I mean, maybe I'm not fully white, but I still consider myself a white person. We are missing, if we're scientists, we have to acknowledge we're missing most of the data because we are just bringing one perspective of teaching and of learning.
And we just admitted that I know I only had one black teacher my whole life and you had none. Mm-hmm. So it's there you go. At what point, other than my teaching degree, but let's take that out. Mm-hmm. At what point was I supposed to be challenged? At what point was I supposed to learn these things? Institutional racism would have been alive and well in all of the ways that I was taught, and I wouldn't have been challenged. And I don't remember being challenged until my teaching degree in the obvious racism in society that we live in, which is now being brought to light in a very important way through these protests and through everything that is happening online. It's just, honestly, all that's happening is people are just saying the truth. And it's finally feels like it's being heard. And we'll see again because it's Monday, June 1st.
And yeah, it's really frustrating because it takes a excruciating painful event to acknowledge racism, something so blatant. And this is what I think a problem I seeing on the internet. Say we tweet something in solidarity, or say we just are sharing these science studies and you're reading comments. Often what the point we should all be at is also talking about nuanced racism. It's not just about someone literally saying something awful or literally being blatantly racist to someone or literally killing somebody. It's so much more than that. And I think we all need to it's kind of sad that it takes this such brutal event because there's lots of people that go oh yes, that is clearly racism, who are still not willing to acknowledge that there's racisms in so many other forms. Institutionalized racism and even just neglect, right? Being part of a system that isn't necessarily, I guess that's the problem. No, most institutions are not trying to impart racist ideals on you, but by not having representation, that's going to create an echo chamber of ideals and beliefs and ways of thinking that are conducive to racist thoughts, or just feeling separate, feeling other than, feeling unfamiliar with. And there's a ton of studies on representation and the impact they have, whether that's for Black people, whether that's for queer people, whether that's for women in STEM, and showing that just literally seeing people in those positions can change entire groups of people's perspectives. Not only if a queer person sees another queer person represented, is that going to inspire them, but if a straight person sees a queer person represented, that's going to change the way they view scientists, the way they view teachers, the way they view everyone. I just think there's tons of studies that just show representation. Even part of our video, we talk about just showing people, black people, in a positive light. So when people look at videos or pictures of Beyonce, their biases minimize almost instantly, because
I know, I love those Beyonce studies.
like beyond the power of Beyonce, but it just goes
Really?
to show when you're watching someone who's inspiring and talented and makes you feel good, and they're a black person, suddenly that impacts your bias towards black people. And I think that goes obviously in many different directions. It just goes to show how much representation matters. And on top of that, this may seem obvious, but it's just like being around or being exposed to other people is what lowers your racial bias,
So
or just
contact theory.
Yeah, or your bias in general. So if you're gonna, like, you're hanging out with us, if you're a straight person, you probably have less bias towards queer people, even if at first you had more. You're chatting, you're hanging with Mitch and Greg, and there's that.
Well, they are like, wow,
exposure.
that Greg guy has a really annoying gay voice. I hear that all the time. Sometimes I hear my voice, I'm like, well, it is annoying and gay, but that's just sometimes what our voices are. Okay. But I think that that's true. And I think that one thing about why we're all here right now is because there is a white supremacist in the White House. There is an evil, racist white supremacist running the American country right now. And I think that that cannot be denied, and it no longer should be denied. And I think that is one of the reasons why it's escalated to this point, because he's not backing down with his racist ways. And they use Barack Obama in a lot of examples of these studies, just showing people him and being in a position of power. They were able to actually like study using EEGs, like literal brain scans, how it changed people's bias. And it's so interesting because it's like, here is a president right now using Barack Obama and trying to continually vilify him. And that, like, there is racial undertones to that. And that's just not even scratching the surface of the racism that this president is inciting. And I think that's part of the issue of what is happening right now. I think it's like racism is alive and well. And when we made this video, it was like, there was a time, like, for example, we were talking about a lot of studies about nuanced racism. So that's why I think it's not surprising to me that we're at this like boiling point. Mm-hmm. Like for the one in that, we're just going to keep talking about these studies, but a 2003 study sent out fake resumes in Boston and Chicago to over 1,300 employment ads. These resumes were literally identical with the exception of the names on them. And yet the resumes with the more typically black sounding last names received 50% less callbacks than the resumes with the white sounding last names. And again, these resumes were identical. So that is another example, like much with like the, with like there being a lot of white teachers, more white teachers than I think there should be. This is an example of the type of racism that white people probably have no idea or have obviously not experienced. And they don't realize.
Not even be like the people who were going through those resumes and actually calling people for
aren't going to be like,
use.
oh, I'm racist. They're just like making a decision.
Yeah, this goes to show how subconscious so much of this is, and how ingrained it is, and how quickly people make decisions without consciously knowing that their brain has maybe clocked something and made a decision based off of that. And that's why I guess it frustrates me, and I know people in my life, and I see people on the internet who are like, but I'm not racist, and they have such a hard time. And I don't feel like I was this way with racism, although I probably was. But I know there's been times in my life when Greg's tried to explain things to me and I get defensive, right? So Greg, because he went to like a really progressive school that like taught about all these issues.
When I went to teachers college, my high school, I would say was not.
Sorry, yeah, your teacher's college. I remember myself and my friends kind of experiencing this guttural reaction to be like, but no, like I'm a good person. Like I don't do any of these things intentionally. And I think it took me a long time to sort of slow down and go, it's actually not such a bad thing to be self-deprecating. It's not such a bad thing to say like, oh my gosh, yeah, it's okay that I can admit that I have racist tendencies, that I probably have sexist tendencies, that there's things that our society has built around us, whether on a large scale or on a micro scale, wherever you're from, that have given you ideas that you behave on without even thinking about. And to call that out doesn't have to mean that you're an awful person. And I think that's the struggle. People don't want to take on, or more and more people are taking these on, but lots of people still resist it because they think it means. And it's just so frustrating that we have to keep saying like, no, this doesn't mean, like, just because you have privilege doesn't mean every accomplishment you have in your life was easy and that you didn't work hard and that you're not a hard worker. Like, But it's just like, stop talking about that. Like, we're not saying you didn't deserve anything. We're just saying, let's all acknowledge it so we can be better people and support other people and just be sort of self-deprecating, I think.
Yeah, I think like I don't want it to come off like I definitely experienced that defensiveness as well when I was in that like teaching course. I was set up and it was designed to literally teach white teachers how to deal with the fact that institutionally almost everything, unless there's anti-racist institutions in Toronto, which there are some, but other than that, most institutions in the world and places that you go are going to be ingrained in white supremacy and racism. That's the way that colonization has built the Americas. Let's just use the Americas as an example. So it's like sometimes it's helpful to hear that. It's less like you are racist or whatever, but it
True.
is.
But people even have, I think, a struggle dealing with the idea that the foundation of their existence is built on white supremacy.
I know,
because people don't want to hear that, but when you really think about it, of course these settlers that came, we know for fact they thought white people were superior.
Literally think about the word settlers. Were they settling things?
Yeah.
Like every single thing and even the vocabulary of everything you can pick apart and be like, saviors. Oh my God. Yeah.
Like they truly, and I mean, our position as being people who communicate science, there's so much awful history in science, not only abusing minorities, but using science as a tool to dismiss or show that other races or cultures or gender
or colonize indigenous
us.
Knowledge. Like, why don't you go into that explanation that from your book about, I think it kind of relates to that.
Which?
The fact that like science has been used in the past to sort of like trump indigenous knowledge, and then it comes out later that in fact what the indigenous people were saying
I mean,
was correct.
So this book is called Superior. It's an amazing book that kind of talks about race, science, and science being used to push forward racial agendas and things like that. And some examples include, one in particular was like court cases that have relied more heavily towards or leaned heavily towards science and genetics in order to dismiss indigenous claims of, say, there was like remains and bones that were found that indigenous people said they belong to us, they're on our land, and we know they come from whatever. And they lost, but later it was actually found out, like the science updated and they were able to prove like that those were indigenous bones. And it was just an interesting example where science knowledge trumped indigenous knowledge. And us as scientists, like, of course we love science, we believe in science, but there has to be a time and a place when we can understand that science isn't always right. It isn't always
rife with white supremacy bias because of the people who are told that they're scientists, because of the people who we grow up seeing as scientists. It's really, really bad.
I want to say one other thing too, like, and I may have said this on the podcast before, so I'm not sure, but there was research that came out recently. Neanderthals, for a long time, we used to look at them as humans. We scientists would be like, oh, they're like so dumb and like stupid and inferior. Oh, they're actually the most similar to indigenous or aboriginals in Australia. Oh, that must explain why there's like inferiorness in those people. And that was the belief for a long time, that these Neanderthals were just like really stupid, and we were trying to find other quote unquote stupid people in the world that matched them. And then in more recent years, there's been a lot of research that showed, a lot of Eurocentric people actually have Neanderthal DNA more than almost anywhere. It's Europe and Asia, but we don't see it much elsewhere. Suddenly, and there's the book Superior lays out articles and highlights starting to go,
oh my gosh, they did art.
Yeah, like, wow, wait, maybe Neanderthals were kind of smart, and maybe that's why white people have slightly bigger brains, because they had bigger brains and we have a bit of their DNA, and so our brains are a little bit bigger than, say, black people.
Like they used to put flowers down on their dead. Wow, look at that. That's so interesting. They honored their dead before humans did. Like, it really did switch within the science. This is pop science. This is science communication. The Neanderthals are such a science communication. Like,
yeah, and I think I've said this before as well. It's like, of course we shouldn't chastise those new results. If that's true, we should show like, okay, yes, European people have more Neanderthals in them, but we have to also be willing to reevaluate and look at the stories we told ourselves with that knowledge and what that meant. So it doesn't mean we should stop looking into science and discovering new things and moving forward and being interested in science, but always being aware of the cultural context that everything's coming in. Basically, all of science comes from the cultural context of Europe. the idea of developing countries versus developed countries, it all comes from this idea of like, let's compare ourselves to these European countries. Let's say England, and it went and it explored the world. Yeah, the Enlightenment was everything.
Even that word
was relative. Yeah, the Enlightenment. The people who were part of the Enlightenment hadn't seen like any of the world. They lived in one little bubble. Yes, there's many brilliant ideas that came out of it, but then think of the perspective they're missing and how many more brilliant ideas can come out of people who have seen other parts of the world.
Like I shouldn't be hyperbolic, but it's like, let's just use a recent thing. We look up vaccines. It's like, okay, vaccines invented by this British person, but then you look it up and it's like, no, actually people were inoculating themselves in China in like 500 BC. Like, you just realize like, we've been taught these things because our teachers were white and Eurocentric. That's the way the textbooks are built. That's the way we were taught here in Canada and in America and in the Americas. So it's so seeped into everything. And I think going back to where we sort of started with talking about this is like, there is that defensiveness, which I want to understand better. Like I
think people just don't want their legitimacy and their own struggle, which everyone has their own struggle, to feel not real or not justified. Yes. Like somehow my pain actually doesn't count because it's actually not that bad.
So that's so interesting. So like that brings me to something called the hierarchy, which I think is like so important. So we know about something called like the patriarchy, like these ideas of archy. Patriarchy, obviously, I think another thing that's very obvious is how we live in a patriarchal society. You take your dad's last name is a great example. You look around at who's running countries, majority men. We live in a patriarchy almost internationally. The hierarchy is a way of like looking at privilege as like a very intersectional, varied thing. So for example, class is, I think, an important one for maybe a lot of white people to talk about. You can have privilege in your affluence, and if you just focus on class, there can be poor white people who will be suffering at the hands of the classist structures, which are based, again, if we talk about institutional racism, there's institutional classism. And those white people are still going to be suffering from a lack of privilege from the fact that they don't have a higher status when it comes to class than other people with money. But it's like everything is linked. But so then there might be a more affluent black person, but those white people who are maybe poor and maybe don't have as much privilege when it comes to finances need to still also acknowledge the fact that they have privilege with the color of their skin based on the fact that white supremacy is real and built almost all of our institutions. So even that affluent black person who might have privilege in their affluence doesn't have the privilege that a white person would have who was poorer. Like,
I think it's just all acknowledging, being like, I'm a queer person, I'm a gay man, so in that way, I have a lack of privilege, say, against straight people because I get discriminated against for that. But then I'm a white person, and I'm viewed as a white person in the world, and then I grew up in a pretty affluent family, and I have these privileges. It doesn't take away the fact my struggle for being gay or being queer, but I still can acknowledge that I have a privilege in some ways and lower privileges in other ways. And it's not a game of let's add it up and see who's the least privileged and the most privileged. Although I think there's levels where we know that's the most privileged person. But to just be a person who's privileged allows you to say like, okay, then I should use that to help other people. I should use that to do good in the world. I should use that to also give me empathy. Like, I think that is one thing I've realized, and certainly not all queer people are like this. But when it comes to race issues, I think it's maybe easier as people who have been discriminated against to relate, even if it's a completely different issue. Do you agree?
I mean, this is so funny.
Or at least empathize. Relate might be the wrong word. Like, I certainly have no idea what it's like to be a Black American or an Asian American or any country, really, any other race than myself. But I can understand what it means for people to not understand or believe my own suffering.
Like even something like a microaggression. It's like, what that feels like.
To experience my daily life and know the little moments when people say things that I just have to ignore, and also the non-microaggressions, like being uncomfortable in spaces to hold your hand, being uncomfortable to make other people uncomfortable if we were to kiss in public.
Also, I think you could maybe, and I know I'm going back to education a lot because I think maybe that's where I was taught a lot of these things, but it's like you can know what it feels like to grow up in school and be like, oh, I'm not talked about ever. Like that's a big one. Like you don't get talked about as a queer person in school.
What do you mean?
no one explains to you, like, your sex ed isn't taught properly. Like, you didn't even get sex ed. You were in a Catholic school, so your whole
I didn't
existence.
get not sex ed, but it was like very limited. They're not allowed to tell you about like condoms and stuff.
Yeah, I would say you didn't get sex ed. You weren't acknowledged in your education. That's
Right.
also what we're saying. That's exactly what happens to Indigenous people, to Black people in Canada. Their history is ignored for white supremacist values, and we learn the history of our country through the white man's eyes. And so you know what it feels like to have your history taught to you through like a straight person's eyes.
Totally. And even just my daily existence, to live in a world where I'm often reminded of my sexuality, even when I don't choose to be.
Yeah.
Like, I don't always think about it. It's a part of me. It doesn't fully define me, but the world around me makes me constantly aware of how I behave and how I'm perceived because of the risk that comes with being queer. And so because of that, I think when I see these other issues of social injustice, I think that might be why it's easier as a queer person to say, I don't get it. Like, I've never experienced it, but I can empathize. Like, they are telling the truth.
But it's funny because we've come here equipped with science studies that explain racism, how it's real and how it's physiologically damaging. But I agree. But I that's a fascinating thing to study. Like, the empathy towards these movements from different groups of people. Like, are women more likely to even like, you could do this study, like, here you go, grad students, you could like a sociology study where we have all this information on Twitter. What happens when you break down who even has, let's use the example, use the hashtag Black Lives Matter hashtag, looking at based on their names. I guess it's hard to know people's like sexuality, but you can find it out. Like, I don't know. That's a very interesting study because I feel
it may not
similar,
be true.
but I also don't.
I think so. That's an anecdotal experience
And
that
think
I
of
try to
how many
understand why lots of queer people don't care. Is that what you're gonna say?
Yeah,
Are
I have
people?
so many, like, I've had so many frustrated conversations with mostly white gays, as our community calls them, and it's like, it is really frustrating because eventually you're just like, I don't know. I get really emotionally frustrated because I'm like, what? You're gonna seriously sit there and like bask in the privilege that, again, we have learned this over and over, that people of color are the reason why there's a gay rights movement, why Stonewall happened. Like, I don't know. It frustrates me when I think there's a lot of queer people. I think queer is the wrong word, actually, because a lot of people identify as queer, I think, are more aware of these things. A lot of gay men in my life who I've talked to have been extremely like further behind than I would have thought when it comes to like the idea that racism is real.
Right. Yeah. I didn't mean to suggest that just being
I'm
gay.
Not.
I'm trying.
This is what happens when you do science studies. We're just like, we're anecdotally.
I was anecdotally trying to psychoanalyze my own understanding and compassion towards these issues, and like, I feel that I've been feeling so sick and exhausted and tired, and I can't imagine what it feels like to be a Black person right now, even in Canada, even having to see people in Canada be like, thank God we're from Canada where this doesn't happen, bullshit, right? Yeah. And there's people here who are
although I get that, obviously, like, I don't want to like minimize the fact that they are different countries, but like, I haven't even seen that.
We don't have like a militarized police force. I mean, maybe we do, but not in the same way.
No, it's not in the same way, but it still is like I think I would hope a lot of people in Canada don't think that. Again, if I had a friend be like, "Oh, we're so lucky to live here," I think I would just be like, "Are you serious? Like, come on! Like, let's talk about that as well." Okay, let's go into just some more of these studies. This one is about like the medical institutions, and so I think that like this is interesting when it comes to coronavirus as well, because we have seen obviously that this is affecting people of color. Coronavirus is affecting people of color for a variety of reasons. A lot of them are socioeconomic, though, and people who actually still had to work during what's happening in the pandemic. It's like there's another example, very acute example of privilege. But this one studied white medical professionals and found that half of the sample size that they studied believed false biological differences between white and Black patients. For example, these white medical professionals thought that Black patients were more pain tolerant than white patients. And they thought this was because of less sensitive nerve endings and thicker skin. Those ideas are so racist, but these people didn't, when they asked them after, didn't feel like they were racist. But it's like, this is exactly getting to the point where it's like, just because you aren't actively being racist doesn't mean that you're upholding racist values. And I think this is something I have since that education been able to say comfortably is it's like people get scared when I say this, but it's like I am racist because of certain things that I know I just cannot at this point in my life, being a almost 32-year-old white man, have not just been ingrained in me. And those things you have to just like acknowledge. And like, I think that is like one of those things that happens is like when you start to call people out, they go, well, I'm not racist. I'm not racist.
Right.
It's like, wait, but okay,
That's what I mean. There's a kind of a difference between explicit racism and implicit racism, right?
But I don't even like those words because it's like, then people can start hiding behind. I don't know. I'm trying to like be like, as a white person, it's like, why can't we just accept that like, that is the way we have been taught and acknowledge that we have been taught to be racist.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I guess sometimes it's like, I get why people would like, that's not the
I
right
agree.
way to approach it, but that's sometimes what I'm just like, yeah, like
I do agree. And I think it is, I'm
trying to think of like times like when I've been called out, like obviously I get defensive, but also sometimes a lot of the time upon reflection that it's like you're learning. Like I'm always like, it's learning something.
Yeah, but you have been taught from your family life and values, and obviously like you've gone through education to teach you how to take on those kind of new ideas, which ironically is what a scientist should be, right? Where we see like there are lots of science people, and myself included, I think I have a harder time changing my opinion than maybe. Actually, I don't know if that's true, depending on the issue. But
Well,
I think
you've-
in this instance,
In
I
a
think-
therapy, we've learned that you have a harder time being wrong.
yeah.
So like it's probably linked to that. It's like if people are telling you you're wrong.
gonna air my therapy on.
Sorry,
I'm joking.
No, but I mean, I think it's actually really interesting, and like I just think it's interesting because I think that there is something there. It's like that is the hard part. It's dealing with the fact that you were
that's my
wrong.
question as like white people talking to other white people, because I can understand as a queer person talking to straight people, I want to smack my face sometimes and smack their face, but like in the circle of this where it's like, okay, is it more effective to talk to white people and say, look, we all just have to admit we're fully racist and that's what we have to do? That might be the right answer. Or is it better to say, look, like we should have the distinction because people are so holding on to these ideals that they cannot live with cognitive dissonance. They can't call themselves a good person and a racist. So we need to now distinguish between like implicit and explicit. Explicit being like, yeah, you can agree that you are not like saying awful words towards minorities and you are not actively trying to hold up these ideals, but implicit racism is a thing that you're not always actively choosing, and maybe explaining it that way allows people who are defensive to turn down their defense and go, oh, you know what, maybe I am doing things that are racist when I'm not meaning to, because I'm a good person and I can make mistakes, and right, like
okay, I'm like there shouldn't be where everyone just has to say I'm racist. Okay, I can see why that's like extreme.
But I understand what you mean, because from a queer perspective, it's just like everyone is homophobic, even gay people have homophobic tendencies. And I even say that, like I say that now, I'm like, I am homophobic. Right.
Like I obviously feel like I'm just like a weird person who says radical things, and I could see why someone's like, that's not helpful for you to say that. But it's like, I literally like how often I am aware of the times in my life where I do something that is innately homophobic. It's nuanced and I'm aware of it, but it happens all the time.
Yeah, totally.
Who you find attractive. Even my voice being annoying, like when I hear my voice, I'm like, oh my God, my own voice is annoying. And I'm like, is that literally linked in my own homophobia to my own voice? Like, and I just think it's like I grew up and was taught by TV shows, by teachers,
right,
by like everyone to be homophobic.
Yeah.
So it's like, as much as obviously I'm gay and I've learned a lot, there's certain things you can't shake. And so that's what I'm trying to say with that. But I think you're right. And I think what's happening right now, which is fascinating, is that everyone is sharing their versions of ways that they're learning about white supremacy and learning about the fact that white supremacy controls institutions and learning about police brutality. Like social media is a fascinating thing to look at right now. A, because we're in a pandemic. So it's like one of the main forms of communication. B, this really has, like, with a racist white supremacist as a president, really exacerbated things to the point where people are figuring out how for themselves they can contextualize this. And I think that is like really interesting. Conversations that are happening right now online are conversations that I like are quite radical from the context of anti-racism. They shouldn't be, but like are really important and nuanced and fascinating, and people are figuring out for themselves how they're figuring out that everything is racist. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it honestly, it's like scientific literacy. And sometimes there's a huge gap, a bigger and bigger gap between people who are interested in science literacy or understand science communication. And I don't mean like science communicators, but literally being able to read science news, and people who are not. And I feel like that gap's getting bigger, bigger and bigger. And I think this is like social literacy, or what would you call it? Like racial literacy.
Anti-racism literacy.
And so it's difficult to have conversations because if you're educated about it, you're using language and you've come to terms with things that lots of other people haven't and or don't understand. And so I think that may be what's happening. And is that we're like, not that people are becoming more extreme, but we need, in the same way that we need science communicators to help tie the public to science ideas and keep people educated and inspired and connected to the world
and
of science.
Also need the science communicators to call out the racism in science.
Totally. But we also need, I guess I was trying to say, like, we need, science communicators to do it, but just generally people to take on these ideas of like racial and social injustice communicators in a way that allows people to connect and stay informed. I don't know. Do you know what I'm?
No, I know exactly what you're saying. Like,
there's like a big gap between,
but it's being closed right now. Is that what you're saying?
It is being closed, but for some people, and some people are getting left behind, and it's harder and harder because it's like trying to explain. Like, I don't know. Sometimes when I have to explain like queer issues to people, it's like I don't want to say they're so far behind, but they maybe have like never been exposed and they've never been educated. And so you have to remember where your brain was. Like, there was a time before I was out when I was fully in these ideals of being sort of homophobic and being afraid of talking about things. And you forget how far you come. Like, when you came out, when you went to school, you start say all these different issues, social issues that you care about. You've maybe now spent like 10, 15 years reading about it, talking about it, debating it with friends, and you can really form ideas and opinions that it becomes really hard. It's like when a physicist tries to teach, but they're too smart because they can't remember what it's like to be stupid.
So what is your point though? Because I'm like, what is your point? Because I thought you were relating to now people are getting smarter with this, or because
I actually don't know. I think the internet can help in some ways, but I'm just trying to not justify, but like create an awareness around this illiteracy around social and racial issues, and like. But
maybe
the internet's fixing that.
I would say like I'm not saying that,
but it might be making it worse in some other ways.
I don't know. I haven't. Maybe I am just being optimistic, but it's like Shawn Mendes tweeting, you have to be actively anti-racist. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like that's something that. Oh, sorry, you're texting.
I'm listening. Sorry, I was just supposed to to a meeting.
Okay. We can wait. We should. No, we should wrap this up soon though, because I feel like we could talk. We really could talk about this for hours. I know who we are, and it's like we just came on to say what we wanted to say, and I think we've sort of said it. But it's like what I was trying to say is that I do think that what has happened has created a literacy around anti-racism that like the change has already started, and it's going to continue because there's obviously needs to be more change. But that word anti-racism is actually becoming something that people are like, you know what? You better live your life anti-racist. Like I know we've talked about calling things out, like you have to call things out, but it just felt like just that word anti-racism is so important. Like, and that's actually what I think we need to talk about with science. Like, science needs to be anti-racist. Like, science and the thing, and I think maybe we can end this talking about science communication and like science to wrap us up. I am so frustrated by like a lot of silences in the science communication community. I am so frustrated by science, especially freaking men, which is dominated, talking about it as this truth, as this whole truth, as this unbiased, like, institution. It's like so frustrating. It's not true. Science is racist, and I'm saying that because I am the one who says that I am racist. This is how I speak. It is built on the backs of racism, the scientific method. It's Eurocentric, and so it frustrates me that people aren't willing to then say, you know what, science also has to be learned and taught and executed with anti-racism in mind, because that's not only going to make it more diverse, which again, okay, we can go into that study, which is that they actually looked at the last names of scientific papers, and the more diverse those last names were, the more likely those papers were to be cited. Essentially, if you think of citations as sort of like verifying the importance of that knowledge, it's telling you that scientific knowledge thrives with diversity. So if you aren't actually a scientist or a science communicator who is aware or trying to be anti-racist, you are a part of the problem. That's what we're all talking about. And so I'm giving it a couple more days of waiting and watching the science community decide how they talk about this before I think I start either calling them out or talking to them privately and then calling them out online. I don't know, but it's really, really frustrating sitting here as ASAP Science and having to deal with this idea that we are speaking truth when the whole fundamental quote unquote truth is based on racism and Eurocentric views. I'm not saying that there aren't things like the ATP, like the way ATP is produced in the mitochondria. Like, I get it. We understand that. To me, that is like I also find the word truth to be really weird. I'm going to if you say, oh, it's true. It's like, okay, our understanding of it is really robust. I can visualize it. I love learning about those pathways. They bring me like pure joy that I can't really explain. They make me feel spiritual. I love science and I love that aspect, but there's just so much of it. And it almost is like microaggressions. It's like when you're talking about physics, it's so surprising to me how often these things come in where you're like, oh my God, that's so like dominating. That's so like, it's so alienating, just like the way that the information is being explained. And so I just think that right now I'm just wanting us as science communicators, as scientists, to remember that like we are a part of this problem, and therefore we have to go forward with anti-racist ideals as we do science. And Katie Mack did a really good tweet about it recently. I love her. And it was just sort of like more succinct than that because she's just way smarter than me. But yeah.
No, that's good. Like, how can we end this on a positive note? Not that
I don't know if it needs to. Oh my God,
I guess. What were you just talking about?
I do. My positive thing was that Shawn Mendes said anti-racism.
Sorry, I also meant the positive note is also that research thrives on diversity. Science thrives on diversity, and people with different perspectives thinking and tackling problems that are different. And that includes differences in gender identity and differences in race and differences in
the climate change movement. We need indigenous minds, and we need that indigenous knowledge in order to understand how we deal with this climate. So exactly, like, if we want to go forward and just be like a bunch of white dudes and like our freaking Elon Musk vibes, like, and think we're going to get to the bottom of climate change, hun, you're wrong.
Okay.
I don't know. Am I annoying and always just have to go one step further and say something like ridiculous about Elon Musk? Oh, no.
Yes, you are that.
Yeah, I am not sorry.
But I guess we need that sometimes.
I don't know if we need that.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I just kibosh your positive now?
Yeah.
No. Okay, then say it again. Pretend that never happened and I never did it.
No, it's fine. I don't mind. Just like, I just think like, if we should be angry at people, but then we need not a solution, but we can inspire them as well. That's all I think. It's kind of like the 1-2 punch. It's like, you are bad, but here's how you can be good, and this is why it's exciting. I don't know. Like, there's just like an element to sometimes just beating people down to feel bad that I think is important, and I don't want to dismiss that kind of activism where we're just like, fuck the system and stop this crap.
Yeah.
But then there's another part of me that's like, how can we also make sure there is that like, here we move together. Let's find a way to feel cohesive. We know all these biases exist naturally in humans. Maybe not naturally, I shouldn't say that, because we know like kids don't have these biases, and if you put them in another family, this was another study, it's like adopted kids will take on the projections of their parents even if they're not of the same race. So like their beliefs and their biases are implicitly in them. Obviously not when they're born, but your parents and your environment create such that. But where was I going with this?
Just like the idea that like people need to have a way forward.
Yeah, I hope we can be finding ways to be inspired. I think any movement needs like the hard end and then the variables in between, where some are like trying to be inspiring. Same with climate change. We need the people who are like, this is the truth and the world is going to end. And then we need the people who are like, let's get inspired by like, here's a bunch of things that can make us feel happy and excited and motivated to move forward.
Crisis moments. They used to talk about that in teachers' college. It's like surprising. If you look back on times when you maybe learned a lot, it's when you felt a crisis. Like totally. Even getting a failing grade or something can be that
Sticks in
shock
your mind.
that makes you then figure out how to learn what you just failed in order to do better next time. And this might be the crisis moment for like all of us. Anyways, okay. I hope that was helpful in some ways.
Yeah, hopefully it wasn't too, I don't know. Obviously, this is like not a normal podcast, but we just kind of wanted to come on and talk about this and bring our perspective in the bubble that we live in and from the perspective that we have.
We have this video is called The Science of Racism. You can find it on YouTube. You can use hashtag side note podcast to like let us know any other research in this vein. The video was 2 years old. We spent like so much time figuring out these studies, figuring out how to explain this properly, obviously, because if you don't get these things right, there's a lot of white supremacist people out there and trolls who want to take you down. So if you have any more research in the last 2 years, that we would love to just be knowledgeable on it so that we can talk about it in this space. Essentially, we're asking you kind of do our work for us. Is that bad?
No, help us keep up to date. I think it's always nice when people share research and information with us, and that's a fun experience.
And thank you for listening and commenting. There's been lots of comments this week.
We appreciate you guys.
It.
We hope you're all taking care of yourself in the midst of a pandemic and civil unrest and the world being so uncertain. We appreciate you listening to us and hanging out with us, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.
Peace.